Traditional religious frameworks have been losing influence in many Western societies. So what is filling that void? Many say it's social justice movements, that they offer an alternative to help people find meaning in their lives. I'm Mohamed Hassan, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
I don't start from the supposition that human beings are naturally good. I start from the supposition that human beings are going to surround themselves with their own kind if they can, and it is a minor miracle if we get anything like toleration or pluralism.
But I think broadly speaking, if you decenter Christianity from the conversation, you see that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the United States, but also globally in many ways. That I think it's critical for the world to sort of unlock seeing itself in the mirror opposite image of the West.
But we've never tried a basic thing called for by your understanding of original sin. Repent. Where is the repentance of America? Where is the acknowledgement that what we have done is wrong and we must do something to correct what we've done?
Our question today: has social justice become the new religion of the West? I'd like to introduce our guests. Joshua Mitchell is a professor of political theory at Georgetown University. Khaled Beydoun is a professor of law at Arizona State University. And Michael Eric Dyson is a distinguished university professor of African American and diaspora studies at Vanderbilt. A very warm welcome to the three of you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here.
We're all near Detroit or in its environs, so we feel at home.
So that's what we figured out, is that the three of you have that in common. You all grew up in Detroit, or you have some kind of connection to Detroit.
Oh, yeah.
So I hope you bring that, that
Detroit
sense of
energy.
generosity to this
We're going to agree
debate.
too much. I'm sorry. It's over.
I highly doubt that, because
Yeah,
this is an interesting provocation, because it taps into a lot of very personal things: identity, religion, morality. And at the same time, I would like you to disagree, and I would like you to really put your stake in the ground of where you stand on these issues, issues that relate very much to our modern moment, whether it's justice, whether it's social movements, whether it's the decline of religion in the West. And you might even want to challenge that notion. Is religion declining in the West? Joshua Mitchell, can I have you start by answering this question? Has social justice become a new religion in the West?
Well, the term social justice covers a lot of area. I'm more familiar and more comfortable with the term identity politics, and I'd be curious whether gentlemen around the table also agree. But half my training is officially in political science, but I did half my work in divinity school, and so I've been paying very close attention to the deepest longings, I think, of social justice and of identity politics. And I think the deepest longing on the left, and this is where conservatives, I think, don't get it, is a longing for cleanliness, a longing for purity, and that is a religious impulse. And in fact, the term innocent victimhood, which I think is central to the analysis of social justice and identity politics, in fact, emerges out of Christianity. It's a central Christian category. So my view is, with the collapse of Christendom, you don't get secular world. What you get is what Tocqueville called incomplete religions. And I think the French Revolution was the first one. Marxism was the second one. You could say post-colonialism is a third one, with the colonizer colonized. And I think identity politics is attempting to find the answer to the question of purity and stain. That's why conservatives, and I speak mostly conservative circles, I keep telling them, what you don't understand is that the left does grasp that the central question of life is a religious question, either understood, transformed as social justice, or as the religious longing for cleanliness. And I don't think the right understands that. But I think the left doesn't understand that this really is a kind of, call it an incomplete religion. That's Tocqueville's phrase. And I think that's where we are.
So why do you choose to use the language of religion to describe what many young people would see as a fight for morality or a fight for social justice?
But I think, to come back to my observation about cleanliness and purity, the innocent victim category is the central category of Christianity. And I think what's happened is that when the mainline churches collapsed in America and in northwestern Europe, I think a younger generation was looking for a way to think through cleanliness and purity. And I think identity politics has come along to provide exactly that. So when people say we're not religious anymore, I say you're asking the wrong question, you're looking in the wrong place. Because I think right now we're in what I call the Great Awakening around the world, and it's an awakening unto purity and stain. But it's without God and without forgiveness. So I think it's an incomplete version, as was Marxism, as was the French Revolution. So I think there's a several hundred-year development here, and this is the latest iteration.
Now, Michael, if I can bring you in here, you are somebody that not only grapples in your scholarship with issues of identity and issues of justice, but also you are an ordained minister. So how do you see these two things side by side, social justice and religion?
Yeah, well, I think Joshua's presented a very vigorous and engaging kind of genealogy, if you will, both in the sense of Nietzsche and Foucault, about a very explicit expression of identity and how it has been shaped by circumstances and how religion has played a role. I happen to think that identity politics is intriguing, but misnamed, in the sense that there's no identity more aggressive, vigorous, vile, or violent than the conception of whiteness as the backdrop against which so much is unfolded. If we want to do a kind of specific genealogy in the West, you know, in terms of colonialism, in terms of enslavement, in terms of projecting a white identity as a neutral and objective arbiter of competing and rival identities in the marketplace. So everybody else gets to be called an identity, except the major identity itself is never called to account and called on the carpet of responsibility. I think Joshua's point about innocence is powerful, but think about another former Christian, James Baldwin, who talked about white innocence as a way of absorbing the contact of a dominant culture and coming out yourself innocent, not holding yourself accountable.
What about this idea that there has been a decline of religiosity in the West? Do you even agree with that statement? Do you think it's true? And if so, has there been a void left in its place?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Baptist preacher, so I'm preaching a lot on Sundays. so I hope it ain't no decline.
Are your congregations growing or are they depleting?
You know what? The love offering is pretty steady and it's great. But the thing is, of course, I think, you know, we can talk about, you know, Joshua's point about the decline of religion, and we can say certainly in terms of mainline religious formations, there's certainly been an erosion and a decline. But there's also been a concomitant rise and resurgence in some religious circles. I can speak about the African-American one. I don't know what's happening in Islam and among Muslim brothers and sisters, but I can tell you that there has been a kind of recrudescence, a kind of resurgence of religious belief, but a spirituality, right? And I know that Joshua talks about, you know, spirituality in a very powerful way. I think, you know, spirituality makes religion behave right. So if religion is ligare, to bind together, the formal institutional matrix that receives the spiritual impulse may be on the decline, but the impulse towards spirituality, I think, continues to be a very powerful and vigorous one. Hence, Joshua's point about certain elements of social justice being connected to notions of identity and notions of religion as well.
Now, Khaled, you're somebody that, you know, aside from being a teacher of law, you are somebody that is very upfront and center, not only about your identity as a Muslim, but also about your place as an activist. What do you say to the idea that this identity politics or social justice movements have become this placeholder for something that we've lost in our society?
Well, two things. I think that there's an unfair ascription of identity politics to the left, and specifically to critical race theory and wokeism and whatever term you want to use that is, you know, I think myopic, because there's an identity politics that is, I think, more sinister, as, you know, Michael has stated, and I think a lot more has a deeper rooted history in this country, specifically tied to whiteness and tied to the weaponization of Christianity to advance whiteness. I think it is filling a void, largely speaking, with, younger segments, predominantly white Americans, who are not steeped in organized religion and Christianity specifically, and are yearning for and searching for a range of things, right? First, community. There's a lack of community, which is also being intensified with the rise of social media, right? That's exacerbating individualism, being disconnected from real people. Second is, especially on the left, I think this is where I'd agree that on the left there's a nebulousness tied to identity, specifically with younger white folks, because whiteness is stigmatized and derided within leftist spaces. So, adopting a leftist or radical or progressive identity sort of like fills that void in ways that, makes them more palatable, for instance, in specific communities. Third, I think that there's a really, frightening development with regard to dogma, right? I wouldn't call it religion necessarily, but zeal and dogma, and sort of like subscribing to specific ideologies in ways that are not untrained and not well thought out, that is taking place. So there are some, I would say symptoms of the way we think about organized religion that are taking place, in social justice spaces on the left, but also on the right, right? So for instance, if you look at the followings of people like Nick Fuentes or Candace Owens or Nick Carlson, there's similar patterns of zeal, dogma, but also reverence of these figures as almost being quasi, religious icons in some regards, right? So I think that it's important to broaden the conversation to think about this development of neo-religion as not being just sort of like taking place only in the left. It's taking place on the right as well.
That's really fascinating, Joshua. Yeah, what do you think?
So I started writing about this a while ago. So again, I am right of center, though I call myself a liberal, and we could talk about that. I think it's a threefold division. I don't think it's liberal versus conservative. I think it's liberal, conservative, and left. And I'm still a liberal. So I'm very worried about what's happening on the right. It's the alt-right, and I mean this in a very precise way, because this does trace itself to Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's view was Christianity had exhausted itself. You have this extraordinary burden of guilt and no way to discharge it, and that's why the West was slowly dying. He wrote about this in the 1880s. And so his proposal is, in order to have a tomorrow, that's his exact formulation, we have to forget. And what that means is we're going to forget slavery in America. We're going to forget colonialism in Europe. We're going to forget 2 world wars. We're going to forget the Holocaust. We just don't care anymore. And that is the attitude. I don't know Nick Fuentes. I've never talked with him, and I don't follow him, but I've heard enough about him. So, but I think that is the attitude of the alt-right, and I think that's a very, very dangerous development.
I wouldn't sort of like, ascribe this ahistoricism only to the alt-right. This has been sort of a fixation of the traditional right for a long time, and you see this specifically with the ways in which the traditional right has eroded and undermined, a range of policies that have been enacted to redress the inequalities and segregation that have been doled out against communities of color. I mean, affirmative action comes to mind, right? The erosion of affirmative action and forgetting about, segregation, Jim Crow, slavery, chattel slavery, colonialism. That isn't an innovation or a contribution of the alt-right. This has been a protracted plan of the traditional right that's been taking place for a long time. So ahistoricism is not unique to the alt-right by any stretch.
But there's something new going on. I mean, just follow the debates on the right. We can talk about all the things that you identified, and I'm happy to do that. But something new is happening. You've got a new generation that is completely unhinged from any sense of moral center. And there's a lot of things that say, I'll go back to Reagan. There's a lot of things that the Reagan Conservative Party has to answer for in terms of undermining communities, shipping jobs overseas. This is the great catastrophe of America from the late 19th century or late 20th century. But I do think something new is happening here. This infatuation with Nietzsche. Look, I grew up in Ann Arbor on the left, University of Michigan. Slowly but surely, I do move toward the center. But I never encountered anything like the Nick Fuentes. The John Birch Society was driven out of the conservative movement. Were there racists in there? Of course. I don't start from the supposition that human beings are naturally good. I start from the supposition that human beings are going to surround themselves with their own kind if they can, and it is a minor miracle if we get anything like toleration or pluralism. Let me come back to what you were saying. Look, the reason why, I'll speak positively about identity politics. The reason why it emerged was because of the failure of the American pluralistic model. Madison says, there are all these differences, they'll compete, everything's going to be fine. And it collapsed because of the civil rights crisis, and it collapsed because of women's rights. And that's why? Because presumably under pluralism, everybody's visible, but two groups weren't.
Mm.
And so what happens is you get the attempt to render visible those who had been invisible. And the central mythos of Christianity, and I don't mean falsehood, the central story is that here's a person who everybody thought was guilty, but in fact turned out to be innocent. And so identity politics reveals that the person who's been made invisible should be visible. And that to me is a tremendous advance. The problem, in my view, is that the way it does this is that it makes everybody a representative of a particular group. So there's whiteness, there's blackness, there's these different groups that are effectively essential. And so you can't be a black conservative. You can't be you can't be a woman who wants to be traditional.
Look, it's a fascinating, getting rid of Nietzsche on the one hand and Sullivan back in terms of genealogy is a brilliant move. And look, the second essay on the genealogy of morals about, that forgetting is devastating. But I think about Gore Vidal, who talked about living in the United States of amnesia. So that there's one thing to forget, to be made to forget, and to erase, to eviscerate, and to not remember. The gesture of not remembering, the point you're making in terms of, say, women's rights or African Americans or, anti-Muslim and so on, the truth is that there is one particular identity that is a master signifier, so to speak. And that identity is a whiteness that never has to own up to itself. So when you say, there's whiteness and blackness, there was never whiteness and blackness and brown and the like until whiteness was challenged. Whiteness was presumed to be universal, so that even the quest for a neutral, objective, or universal identity masks the power of whiteness. I mean, you're speaking about de Tocqueville, think about the tyranny of the majority there that gets slipped in. So for me, it's not a matter of, as you said, those invisibilized identities now clamor for and stand in need of recognition. What Charles Taylor talks about, the kind of politics of recognition. That is true. But at the same time, to have that then indicted as the means by which America has or the West has somehow disappeared before our very eyes, or the reawakenings that are occurring, I think means that we're missing a central point. And that central point is who gets a chance to validate or invalidate identities? Who gets a chance to say this is destructive or creative? And I think that in our own culture, if we had an open competition of identities, which sounds rather miserable, according to a kind of fair basis, it would be one thing, but it's not fair at all. And now that we are here, it evokes a kind of resistance, because I think given your I think rather powerful and persuasive argument about and yours too, about a neo-religion and a religious formation, that happens because the real religious impulse has been displaced onto these social movements because of a failure of the religious institutions to do what they're supposed to do. They got theologies of luxury, ethics of leisure, about accommodation to capital, as opposed to the need of human beings to feel connected to each other. And social media, I would suspect that Khaled and I would agree with you about some of the damaging cancel culture, if we can call it that we would both stand tooth and nail against, because it has destroyed the fabric of community that allows people to make mistakes and to say, I'm sorry, and to grapple with how our own fallibility has to be acknowledged in the context of our relations to one another.
I think social media is a fascinating point to touch on, because it's become this battleground for a lot of these conversations. Khaled, do you think that social media overall, on balance, has been positive or negative in terms of understanding some of these? Let's figure it out right now.
He's the young guy.
Oh, I'm not that young. Is it in balance? I think in balance, I would say it's a good thing, even though it's sort of, strapped with a range of perils and concerns that I have, and I'm sure that the gentleman with me would echo. But I think by and large, I think what's been the greatest sort of net positive with social media is its democratizing effect, that it's sort of given voice to communities, largely subaltern voices, marginalized communities, silence communities for a long time to finally have space and platform to air their grievances. I think what's been happening in Gaza over the last 2 years definitely represents that, right? That you could see for the first time the real struggle of Palestinians taking place in real time, right? I think that democratizing effect of social media, giving voice to silenced voices, has been a net positive. But the perils, cancellation, deplatforming, disabling the kind of conversations you should have with people that you disagree with, brings forward sort of like, claims and movements to stigmatize individuals or to sort of ostracize them, which has a quasi-religious dimension to it as well, right? This sort of policing. But I think by and large, it's transformed discourse, but also the ways in which we can air news in ways that were impossible before its emergence.
And it's also allowed people to gather and form communities.
Which has had, that's kind of like that coalescing is definitely has a religious or new religious dimension to it.
And some rather destructive and dangerous ones when you think about, people coagulating around ideals, being radicalized.
Yeah.
We ascribe this to the Muslim terrorists, and as Talal Assad would talk about the suicide bomber, but look at the way in which Christianity has mercilessly exerted terror on people's lives, one Christian killing another.
Yeah.
I think about when Josh was mentioning about the way in which, say, certain forms of discrimination and racism existed. I mean, you had the prospect of Martin Luther King Jr. saying, I look at your churches sometime and wonder who is your God.
Yeah.
Right? I don't even know that God. I'm an atheist. Now, he didn't say this is Dysonian interpolation of Dr. King, forgive me. But, I'm an atheist. I don't even know that God. I don't even know that religious orientation. So I would have more in common with a person who claimed not to know God, not to be religiously involved, but who was concerned about care for the other, concerned about the demonization and stigmatization of marginalized or minoritized communities, or people whose voices need to be heard. I mean, I live in Tennessee, so I have a kind of affection for, white hillbillies and white Southerners who are marginalized.
I want to pull back a bit from the United States and take a look, because I think there's a lot going on here, but part of it is this discussion about identity and justice and how these things come into play with each other. How do you talk about them politically? And we've seen over the last couple of years, over the last decade and a half, tremendous social upheaval in many parts of the world. The Arab Spring, which you've written about before. Of course, the Palestinian movement, which is not just rooted in college campuses in the United States, but it is a global movement. You're seeing lots of social upheaval in Southeast Asia and Africa. Khaled, when you look at what has been happening, how do you explain why there's so much discontent and so much of a search for justice happening in the world as we live it today?
Yeah, I don't think there's a single thread like across these distinct geographies. I think social media has been a conduit for aggrieved communities across these spaces to raise issues and to mobilize. And I mean, the Arab Spring was definitely an example of the ways in which it can be galvanizing, give rise to revolutions that were once preempted by authoritarian governments. But I think that there's also, tying it to, if you want to sort of to globalize the conversation on whiteness, and it's not a perfect analog, right? But I think that there is some sort of parallel with the way in which colonized populations, right, and specifically populations that have been colonized by Western European countries, have been imposed upon governments that are essentially proxies for those governments that have not served them, right? We can talk about, across the Arab world, across Southeast Asia, across Latin America, where, populations are finally rising up. And I think Gaza has an interesting role. Gaza might be a sort of like common denominator to sort of highlight the idea that, this myth of like Western rule of law and human rights that has been sort of like flouted by, powerful Western governments is in fact mythic, right? And in some respects, like whiteness, being used as a sort of like agile and malleable tool to advance the interests of a select few. The rule of law has had that similar sort of dynamic, right? Where Western governments have said, look, we want you to democratize. We want you to implant these forms of government, codes, criminal codes, civil codes, and so on that look like ours. But they haven't worked for these populations, right?
I mean, one of the things that you've written about is the racialization of the Muslim identity, for example.
Yeah.
And how that fits into the global war on terror. How do you think this fits in with this conversation about identity versus religion? What happens when those two things? I mean, was that a consequence of identity politics?
Well,
that
look, and
Muslims
there's so much I wanted to sort of chime in on. I think what's interesting around the conversations tied to Islam specifically is that because Islam, and we can talk about Edward Said and Orientalism, has been oriented as a non-white religion. It's been constructed in ways that have been demonized for centuries, and specifically, I think, even more ominously in the post-9/11 context, where it's easy to castigate Islam as being warmongering, violent, prone to violence, patriarchy, lack of modernity, backwardness, sexism, misogyny. So it's been, in many respects, classed as non-religion from the vantage point of the Christian West, right? Which has greater traction now, in the aftermath of 9/11 and the war on terror. Muslims who are especially pious and practicing are classed as being collectively guilty as a consequence of their identity. We see this in Gaza specifically. Remember that picture where the IDF rounded up 40 Palestinian men, stripped them of their clothes, blindfolded them, lined them up like animals on the soil, right, in Gaza? The message there was that these brown Muslim men are automatically guilty of terrorism as a consequence of who they were, not what they did, which clashes entirely with principles of due process and the rule of law that the West touts.
Joshua, do you think that the West still sees itself through a Christian lens, especially when it looks at its role in the world?
I'm going to say something controversial. Probably stop now.
This is why we're here.
Okay. So, in the 18th and 19th century, Christian missionaries went out to the world and tried to Christianize the world. And my view is that identity politics is the latest version of Christian missionary work. When I taught at Georgetown starting in 2005, identity politics did not exist, and my Muslim students came in and they felt just fine being Muslim students. And the last time I was there, which was 2019, I had a covered Qatari woman come into me and say, Professor Mitchell, why are your colleagues, mostly on the left, telling me I have an identity, I'm a Muslim? Now, this is very, very telling, because my view is this, to come back to what I said at the outset, identity politics is linked in the Christian category of the innocent victim, full stop. The category of the innocent victim is not a theologically central category in either Islam or Judaism. And so my view is, in the 17th and 18th century, the Christian missionaries went out and tried to Christianize the world. Why would any Muslim in their right mind adopt this Christian derivative as a way of thinking through their problems? This is the confirmation of the West's continued influence on the Muslim world and the rest of the world. And my view is, if you want to talk about the Palestinian issue, don't adopt, in purely Islamic, Muslim, Middle Eastern terms, do not use this language of identity politics. But that's what's happened. This is the Christianization of the rest of the world, seeing the very real problems of the world in terms of the category of innocent victimhood. Including, by the way, the colonized and the colonized. This is the colonizer and the colonized. This is the same language. Here are the pure ones, here are the dirty ones. It's the same language.
But it didn't begin now. Your genealogy is powerful, but to me incomplete. The origin of that us versus them, that Manichaean distinction, resides in a Christianization of the world. And I don't know how far you want to go. The auto da fe, the Crusades, what Christianity did when they got in power, the Constantinian compromise, and so on. My point is that identity only becomes an issue when the dominant identity, which never has to assert itself, becomes challenged. There are no identity politics when Columbus is slaughtering West Indians, or trying to establish the world, and blankets that are full of disease are given to native peoples and indigenous folks. There's never a question of identity when the dominant identity has to come out the closet.
I'm not here to apologize for the Trump administration, but let me explain what I think the problem on the right is. And I think this is bigger than the Trump administration. I started out by talking about this earlier when I said I talk to conservative audiences and I say no, race is a wound in America, and you hear a pin drop. I think the failure of the right has been an absolute inability to recognize that the wound of slavery we are still enduring it, and it's going to take another century or two to get over it. And to pretend that there isn't a problem confirms exactly what you guys are saying. These guys it's the James Baldwin problem of amnesia. So I'm with you on that. But let me pick up on something. I know I'm older than you, but
I don't know. How old are you?
70.
Oh, you look good.
You look good.
You look phenomenal.
Start saying what he's saying.
So
What's your skincare routine?
after. So you raised something. It kind of jarred my mind. You were talking about what was happening in the 50s and 60s at Martin Luther King, and there's something that I call the John Rawls problem. So Rawls writes this book, The Theory of Justice, in 1971, and my view was that put an incredible damper on American political discourse, because prior to that, whether it's Martin Luther King or Bishop Fulton Sheen in the 1950s, these Catholics had television shows, the most watched shows in America.
Yeah.
And what happened
Over there,
starting in
Uncle Milton
1970s was John Rawls talks about this thing called public reason. And basically, your religious convictions, check them at the door. If you can't make an argument based on public reason, then we're not going to listen to you. And that meant that Catholics, Baptists, Presbyterians, they had to put duct tape over their mouth and do an active translation. So I'm saying we're now entering a new phase, I think, the post-1945 order, John Rawls, all that, where you can't have strong beliefs. Martin Luther King was the last one, which is why he's the greatest one of the 20th century.
I think you have a very narrow and I think politicized definition of what identity politics means that is only being ascribed to the left. Where Michael and I have been trying to tell you is that we agree in part, but you can't excise, I think, the fundamental identity politic that made the United States and much of the West what it is. And
so why didn't that show up 200 years ago? Why didn't we start talking about identity 200 years ago?
Because whiteness wasn't challenged to the same degree. Because not outed as one among a variety of ethnicities or racial formations, because, we began to understand in arguing for freedom and struggling against white supremacy and struggling against economic inequality and social injustice, the whiteness had to contend for the first time with, settler colonialism and racialized capitalism, all that stuff. If you're a Muslim, you are an automatic terrorist, right? The stigma that has been associated with every identity that is not white has not been accounted for. And as a result of that, there's a missing link. The resentment of contemporary white people misses a historical epic where we had to grapple with whiteness for the first time, and it had to be held to account. Black people were the most powerful form of Christian articulation in this country, and I would argue still are. White nationalists are not the most valuable, valid, or vital, or even virtuous expressions of Christianity, and we can't get that acknowledged because race trumps their religious belief. The real religion in America is whiteness. It is not Christianity.
I agree with you that there are lots of problems. I'm not disagreeing that there aren't problems. What I'm disagreeing with you about is the categories you're using in order to address these problems.
I don't disagree with you in terms of understanding the consequences of a 1619 project, but the beauty of the 1619 project is that it brings front and center the grappling with what the origins of this nation have been about, and the refusal, and I used earlier the term from Gore Beydoun, living in the United States of amnesia. All the major books on the New York Times bestseller, all about history, but it's history from a particular point. It's about Bill O'Reilly trying to tell us about what really happened with Lincoln and so on and so forth. Bless his heart. And so there is a hunger for history, but accept those histories from beneath. Those histories that say we have a grittier, conception of what the truth is about. A genealogy that doesn't comport well with a kind of self-identity of whiteness that wants to remain innocent. At what point, Joshua, do we say that whiteness is not unsolvable. It's not something that can't be undone. We don't have the will to do so. There are all of these complications and consternations around it, but we've never tried a basic thing called for by your understanding of original sin. Repent. Where is the repentance of America?
We don't disagree.
Where is the acknowledgement that what we have done is wrong and we must do something to correct what we've done? When you call us neoliberals, I'll take this. The neoliberal argument is about the retelling of racial remedy based upon, forms and cells of entrepreneurships.
I do agree in some respect. I want to take this conversation to this angle, but the way in which left-oriented identity politics has been deployed by specific segments, I find to be highly problematic. And this whole notion of like collective guilt that is being doled on to white men and white women, I find to be problematic. Back to Michael's point, this notion of collective guilt has always been assigned to Black and brown and Muslim bodies, and still is today, with regard to conversations around criminality, terrorism, illegality, mass incarceration, exactly. But it only becomes an issue, collective guilt, that is, when it's finally being assigned to white folk.
Right.
Like, why has it been an issue? Why has it not been an issue over these last 25 years of the war on terror, the Patriot Act, countering violent radicalization, anti-loitering policies, anti-gang policies in predominantly Black communities, the way in which ICE is now moving into Latinx communities like my own, where I live in Arizona? Why isn't this notion of collective guilt being ascribed to Black and brown bodies a principal issue for the right when it's being weaponized against non-white bodies? But it becomes like this huge issue of concern when it's finally being assigned to white folk.
I'm really curious to what you have to say to Joshua's point that identity politics has created a sense of impotence where people feel like they're trapped in these categories, but that doesn't actually lead to a sense of collective action. Would you agree with that?
And so, in some ways, I definitely do. I mean, even in my work, right, as a consequence of the things that I write about and who I am in the world, you feel as if this sort of like intellectual or existential confinement is assigned to you in ways that really stifles your ability to speak freely on issues that you care about, right? Or in dissident ways, in ways in which I might sort of like veer away from the groupthink on the left or amongst critical race theorists. And I have in many ways. I mean, for instance, speaking up on Gaza as openly as I have within legal academia, has, brought about a lot of sort of, ostracization, even within leftist progressive spaces who have been sort of like silenced as a consequence of staunch Zionist pressures within legal academia. Right. But I think there is a concern where identity politics, can be a straitjacket.
But see, here's the point, and to Joshua's point as well. The problem with the wholesale repudiation of a politics of identity is that it disregards the internal machinations of dissent in these minoritized and leftist communities. There's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of argument. There's a lot of wrangling about what's fracture. The appropriate way. A lot of fracture. There's the great disdain in some segments for the very cancel culture about what you speak. I'm calling it that, right? And the ways in which you can't automatically just disown people. When I was in class teaching a class on Kendrick Lamar, and, my TA said, well, Dr. Dyson, it's about police brutality.
What's your favorite album is?
I would say, Good Kid, Mad City.
Okay.
That's one. And then the one after, what's the one that he got not the one he got the Pulitzer for, damn.
To Pimp a Butterfly?
To Pimp a Butterfly was because he has Tupac weaved throughout. But I'm a Drake man. Don't hate me.
Really?
Oh, yeah. See what I'm saying? See, Joshua, I'm a Drake man. Trust me, I'm in the minority right here, right? And I'll tell you why. Because to me, not like us is the most white supremacist Manichaean distinction between us and them that demonizes the other, that reduces blackness to Compton, and not the global understanding that Drake coming from Toronto and using different identities of blackness that they are unfamiliar with, and therefore they are illegitimate. But anyway, back to my point.
I would love to keep having this conversation because I'm deeply engaged.
Let me say this one thing about
I didn't predict this aside.
This is what I said though. So I'm in the Kendrick class, and it's the video where he used the cop is not a real gun, but he's using a gun. And my TA says, Dr. Dyson, do you think we ought to issue a trigger warning? I said, yeah, okay. Look, this is a video about police brutality. The cop has a gun. The gun got a trigger. He gonna pull it. Show the video. So, like, look, a lot of us are through with the fastidious attention to narcissism masked as rigorous commitment to revolution and resistance. Come on, bro. So but I'm saying we don't understand that there is this kind of argument, this vital disquisition, this vital dispensation of difference that's being distributed among ourselves. And we're arguing in ways that because we're being painted by one brush, we never get acknowledged for the kind of nuance and the complexity that we can bear.
I think this is a good moment to try and drive ourselves home a little bit. And I find it so fascinating that so many of these words, redemption, repentance, original sin, keep getting invoked again and again in how we talk about this issue. And Joshua, if you can take us forward where you think this movement is going. You called it an incomplete religion. Does that mean that there's a way to complete it? Or do we have to give up on this religion? Do we have to become agnostic or atheistic to it and then return to something else that was there before?
And invite me back when you do the Drake versus Kendrick. I want to be in.
First on my list.
All right, thank you, bro. That's a serious discussion we have to have.
I'm agreeing with many of the problems. I just think that the language of identity politics, where you sort out who's pure and who's stained, that's no way to solve it. So either we're going to have a continuation of this identity politics or this incomplete religions, or you're going to have more and more of the Nietzschean option, which is the alt-right, which is we don't care. And I don't want that. I've been fighting about it in print. My view as a Christian in the West is the incomplete religions make a promise of thinking through redemption of the world, but ultimately it ends up destroying half the people who are the impure ones. And so I think that the categories of redemption have to be returned to the church fully so that we can solve the problem of staying there, so that we can get on to solving the actual problems that we're all agreeing exist through political means rather than theological means.
Are there either of these options you think is the way that we're going, first of all, but also is the way that we should be going?
So I'm a Muslim. I'm from the Midwest. I'm from Detroit. If you go to places like Dearborn or parts of Detroit or Philadelphia or Camden or Minnesota, Minneapolis, I would offer the alternative of religious pluralism, right? This whole notion that individuals have the right to freely exercise their faith in ways that they see fit, whether it's through, the sort of structure of organized religion, or if it's agnosticism or new religion as being sort of solutions, but or new sort of like, prisms in which they can sort of like organize and see themselves and organize their communities. But if the only solution in sort of construction of American identity and salvation is to be sort of anchored in Christianity, I think that's problematic because it sort of perpetuates the sort of cycle that if you're not this, then you are not first class.
Michael, unfortunately, we have limited time, although there are so many branches of this conversation we can go in. But to give the final word to you, talking about identity politics, which you have defended, talking about religion and religiosity, do you see them as being walking hand in hand towards a path towards justice, or are they in conflict with one another? Do we need to pick one route or the other?
Thank God, and I mean this literally, that a certain variety, a genus and species, if we look at the relationship of Christian identity, has not been permitted to eviscerate my standing as a human being, as a citizen, and as a member of the church writ large. So for me, given what Khaled just said, and I can identify with what Joshua was saying in terms of the West and religious discourse, and specifically Christian discourse, but I have found it to be an enemy of my humanity. That white Christian nationalism has undercut me. White Christian nationalism has not said, as a fellow Christian, let me join with you to figure out a way beyond the impasse imposed upon us by arbitrary or contingent barriers that we must now together remove. No, it has deferred to whiteness as the ultimate option in its own moral discourse. The quiver is full of arrows, but they are all pointed at me, not in my defense.
So I believe at that point, what Khaled has said, that the Disestablishment Clause is a gift from God. No religion shall be established as formal and institutionalized from the American government. Therefore, they all can flourish. If Tim Tebow bows on the ground and prays to God, he is celebrated. If a Muslim does that and prays to Allah, he is seen as an enemy of the state. So I believe ultimately that we must together work toward the belief and what Josh was talking about, that there can be transformation. We can believe in God as the motivation for participating in a language that is universal, that includes everybody, that allows all peoples, religions, orientations, sections, and divisions to come together under a language that respects the integrity of our individuality and yet confers upon us a value in our collective spirit.
We also have a global audience, and I wonder, Khaled, what you think they can take away from this conversation today.
Oh, a lot. I mean, a lot of concern that I think I'm very pessimistic about the future of the United States with its rifts racially and religiously and these culture wars that are taking place. But I think broadly speaking, if you decenter Christianity from the conversation, you see that, you know, Islam is the fastest growing religion in the United States, but also globally in many ways. That I think it's critical for the world to sort of unlock, seeing itself in the mirror opposite image of the West, right? And to build a sort of like indigenous sort of separation in ways that, can promote pride, can promote self-determination, can promote, ideas for state building and society building that are not centered to the West and not centered to Christianity. And I think you're seeing that in some regards with some of the movements that you made mention of earlier. And I think that's one primary takeaway that I'd highlight.
And Joshua, is there a universal takeaway from this message, this conversation that you think we can end on?
So my caution is the one I raised before, which is I do see this identity politics language as emerging out of Christianity. And, having taught in the Middle East for the better part of 15 years, the thing that really does surprise me is young Muslims who want to recover an authentic Islam. But I find I listen to them and I hear echoes of Rousseau, of Marx, of Nietzsche, of postmodernism. And my view is a healthy Islam, I'm confirming what you're saying, that a healthy Islam is going to have to draw on indigenous resources. And my worry is that the West has so penetrated the Muslim world, especially with identity politics, that in fact you're doing harm to your attempt to find your own voice by invoking these categories that are essentially Christian.
And I want to thank you, Joshua Mitchell, for being here today, Khaled Beydoun, Michael Eric Dyson. This has been a fascinating conversation. We are going to come back and talk about Drake and Kendrick at some point,
yes,
I hope.
Yes, let's do that. Let's do that. That's the real division. That's the real division in the world. Drake or Kendrick? Which one are you?
Absolutely. Right. I'm not going to say who I am, but...
Oh, my goodness.
You look like a Drake guy.
Huh? Listen, man, we were getting along.
That's on a diss.
I mean,
see?
I guess I gave myself away a little bit there.
I want to make me join Joshua. Okay.
I want to thank the three of you for your rigorous spirit, your intellectual rigor, and the passion that you brought to this conversation. I hope that you enjoyed listening to this. I know you have a lot to say about this conversation as well, whether it's identity politics, religiosity, redemption, original
Drake said
sin.
Jealousy is just love and hate at the same time. Just remember that, okay?
I mean, we might, I don't know if we want to end on with the Drake quote, but let's here we are now.
Kendrick said, "Ain't nobody praying for me."
Kendrick said, "I ain't black, don't call me no more."
There we go.
That's your guy?
Joshua, do you have any music lyrics that you want to reference?
The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. Let's give him some love.
There we go. Thank you very much for listening. My name is Mohamed Hassan, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.